Anchoring, and why the first thing we hear about a topic matters so much. You're watching Making Sense with Robbie. Let's get started. I don't know about you, but I think the best ice cream is chocolate ice cream. So for a lot of us, we probably think that bears hibernate in the winter. And I think that this happens because when we first hear about hibernation, the first thing that comes to mind is bears. And I think that probably this is something like a meme that we see in TV shows, or that something that comes up as we're growing up. But the thing is that like bears actually don't hibernate. Instead, bears do something slightly different. There are different like sort of physiological aspects of hibernation. But what actually hibernates is something like a squirrel. And so like while bears sort of rest and go into like the sleep state, for the wintertime, their body doesn't completely stop functioning the same way that a squirrel does. While we all associate bears with hibernation, bears actually don't hibernate. We're anchored, or we're like sort of associating this idea of hibernation with an animal that doesn't hibernate. Today, I want to talk about anchoring. The anchoring effect is a cognitive bias whereby an individual's decisions are influenced by a particular reference point or anchor. Once the value of the anchor is set, subsequent arguments, estimates, etc., made by the individual may change from what they would have been otherwise without the anchor. The first thing that we hear, the first sort of piece of information, the first number that we hear, it influences the way that we think about the topic or the thing going forward. And it's important because like we kind of always like reference back to this first piece of information. It sort of becomes our standard, even if it's like totally irrelevant or irrational. It's still like the sort of the starting point. And so like it just has that high influence that it probably shouldn't have. And like a way that this often happens is that when you're trying to buy something and you're sort of negotiating a price, like the first person to speak sort of sets the starting point, right? So if someone's selling something, they might say some price that's way over what it's actually worth. Whereas if someone's trying to buy something, they might say something way below what it's worth because they want to influence the price down or up. And so it's a matter of keeping in mind that sort of the first number influences the direction where you can go. And just like a personal example of this, like many years ago, I went to India and I was walking down the street and I saw like there was all these street vendors and stuff. And one of them had some socks and I was thinking that I needed socks. So I went to look at the socks and I kind of picked them up and I looked at them and the guy said to me like $50. Like he didn't say $50. He said something in the price of rupees, but like I remember it was like $50 Canadian at the time. And I thought like that's ridiculous. Why was he saying this? And that's kind of his point though, right? It's like if he says $50 and the socks are only like worth $5 or something, or even less than that, then maybe if I get down to like $40 or $20, then I'll feel like I'm getting a deal. Like even if it was $10, I would feel like I was getting a deal because he said $50 in the beginning. But if the socks are actually worth $5, then I paid twice as much as what they were worth, but I would still feel like I got a deal because the first price that was mentioned was so over the top. We could get scammed and feel all right about it because it's so much less than what we thought it was supposed to be. Like at the same time, this is really important with the media, or this is really important with stories that we hear, because the first story that we hear is going to have a huge effect on how we think about the topic going forward, how we think about the topic in the future. And it's also going to sort of frame or influence our reasoning, our rationality about that topic moving forward going on. As an example of this, my wife and I recently watched a Son of Sam documentary that was on Netflix. And it was just talking about this sort of alternative theory or this alternative investigation about what actually happened. What was interesting though was that like the killer had written a letter to this journalist, and so the movie was basically from the journalist's perspective. And the sort of convicted killer had said, no matter what evidence you put forward, like people aren't going to believe you. And it was kind of ended up being true because this journalist got totally obsessed with investigating, and he even like talked to the killer in prison, and he admitted that he wasn't the only person that was involved. There was other people involved in the killing, but there was never like a further investigation of it. There was never any like sort of action by the police. And so it ended up that because people like had this really visual representation of the person who was the killer, then it was really easy for people to kind of accept that that's the truth of the matter. But the reality was, at least according to this documentary, that story wasn't actually accurate. Like there were other people involved, but they kind of got away with it because there was this huge story that broke out about this single killer and that he was the person who was behind it. And that stuck. It was able to keep people's minds on that sort of initial interpretation, that sort of initial view of things, even if that that might not have actually been accurate, even if that wasn't the truth. What's important to remember here, though, is that like the world is incredibly complex and complicated. Most issues are huge and involve many different moving parts or different systems. What happens or why it matters what we hear first, like the seed that we hear, is so influential is because we kind of build up our understanding of these complex issues from the first piece of like solid evidence or solid information that we have. And the reality is that we kind of build our information around what we hear first, like the first piece of information, and it might not be accurate, but because it came first, it has like this huge impact. And again, this gets magnified by the fact that things are so complicated. There's so much complexity in the things that are happening in the world around us. And so it's always harder to make sense. And so this means that while it's harder to make sense, it's even harder to make sense when you have some bad information sort of that's poisoned the well, that sort of influenced your thinking, and it's wrong or like it's inaccurate. Or you're giving extra sort of credence to some information despite, your other evidence that you have. I kind of want to ask you a question though, like, what do you think is the best ice cream? And so I'm wondering, did chocolate pop into your mind? Was chocolate maybe the flavor that sort of came to mind right away? And if it was, and that's not your favorite ice cream, or it is, it doesn't matter, just remember that I said that right at the beginning of the video. And that was kind of the point, was to sort of seed you or anchor you to an idea about something and then see if it worked later on. And so maybe that worked, maybe it didn't, but that's just kind of like a way to test it out in real life. And to sort of put this in the bigger picture, the grander picture, if the first story that we hear is so influential or is so important in how we think about issues, then this kind of might make sense why like sort of powerful or rich people or influential people might put out stories about them or about things that they're involved in, and they put those stories out just before a big story breaks out to sort of get it out there in the public's mind. So that is what people think about. That's what they reference to. And in a way, it will make them not think as much about the later things that come out. It will make them sort of have a different view of those things. It will put them in a new light. This is an interesting way that anchoring can be used to influence us by sort of powerful, influential people. So as long as a story that is positive comes out first, then you're going to have like a different view of the person when this other story comes out, when this maybe more damaging or negative story comes out. And this is all because you were anchored to this more positive perspective that came out first. And this is kind of the reason why it's so important in the media to be first, because if you're first, then you influence the consciousness, you influence the collective consciousness about like how the people will think about that topic. And so my question to you is, like, do you believe the truth, or you just latch on to the first thing that you heard? And maybe you haven't even realized that you're latching on to this sort of anchored information, this first thing that you heard, because it's not always so obvious. It's not always clear to us that we're being sort of tricked or that we're falling for this cognitive bias. So let me know in the comments below what you think about anchoring. Have you ever felt like you've been anchored, or you have any examples of anchoring that's happened sort of in your life, maybe in a purchase of something or in just a thinking about things? If you found this entertaining or informative, click that like button. If you are curious about learning how to think about things, but you don't want to be told what to think about them, click that subscribe button, because that's what I'm here for. You've been watching Making Sense with Robbie. Thanks for watching, and we'll talk next time. Goodbye.